We're going to talk about the new imperialism. This refers to a period of time from little after the middle of the 19th century, around 1870, into the very early 20th century. And it refers to this period when European countries set out to conquer and dominate the world.
So here's your terms. As with every lecture, go ahead and write them down and then be listening for them. When Edward VII inherited the British throne in 1901, his empire extended far beyond Britain. One writer boasted, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." So in other words, since the empire circled the globe, the sun always shone on some part of it. And you can see by this map that the British at the turn of the century are controlling land on every continent in the world. And like Britain, other Western powers built their own overseas empires in the late 1800s. The Industrial Revolution and the growth of science and technology had transformed the West. So that's one thing to bear in mind. The new imperialism goes hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution. And armed with new economic and political power, Western nations set out to dominate the world. So what is imperialism? Well, imperialism is when one country exercises control over the internal affairs of another. So basically, you've got one country, like say Great Britain, coming into another, taking control, imposing their government, their political system, their form of economy, their cultural beliefs, their religion, and so forth. So think about this as you read Things Fall Apart, because you see this happening. You see the British coming into Nigeria, to the Igbo, and completely transforming this culture as they impose all of their own beliefs. Today, there's a trend towards cooperation rather than force. But in the period that we're talking about, you've got these European countries coming in and just literally taking over. And this is in the latter part of the 1800s, and it's something called the New Imperialism. In the 1860s and 70s, there was a renewed quest for overseas expansion by a lot of European countries. And in fact, they became bitter rivals for competition. Up until then, most of the Western states were busy with domestic and continental issues. For example, the French Revolution and the revolutions of 1848, nationalism, and so on. So, what is new about this? What sets this apart from past efforts at colonization? Well, the imperialists had science, industry, technology, banks, military and naval power behind them. Those being colonized did not. Between 1870 and 1914, there was a new burst of imperialism with characteristics which set it apart from earlier colonization. First, there's the scale of the new imperialism. Now, during the Age of Exploration, Europeans had gained control of just scattered coastal areas in Africa and a few small parts of Asia. But now, in a burst of new imperialism, 90% of Africa comes under European control. China and Japan are also heavily influenced. So now, it's imperialism on a global scale. Then, there was the role played by industrial technology. There's a demand for new markets, new sources of raw materials, and a demand for a place to sell goods. And all of this fueled the new imperialism and made it easier for Western powers to dominate the world. There's innovations like steam, iron, and electricity that shrank the globe. The new technology altered space and time. Previously, ships had been made of wood. and they were very limited as to where they could and could not go. But there's been improvements in shipbuilding technology, and now ships can move faster and go places the previous ones could not, so they're no longer limited to the coasts. Steam technology can be applied to smaller boats. Steamboats could go up rivers and penetrate the interior of countries. So Africa was called the Dark Continent because for a long time Europeans were unfamiliar with what lay in the interior. We see space being altered by things like the Suez Canal. This was built in 1869, and it allowed ships to sail from the Mediterranean into the Red Sea. So before, if you wanted to sail from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, from Europe, you would have to sail all the way around Africa, down the west coast, around the tip, and back up the east coast. Same thing if you were coming, say, from Syria or Jordan. So this canal completely transformed travel and business. Imagine you're a businessman, a merchant, and you want to get goods from point A to point B as quickly as possible because that means quicker profits. Well, if it takes 3 months to get from point A to point B, it's going to take a while for you to get your profit. But if you can do it in 3 weeks, think how much you can increase your business. Same goes for the military. If you're in a war situation, you can transport goods, men, and so forth a lot quicker. We also see space being altered by the Panama Canal, built in 1914. This allowed ships to travel from the Atlantic to the Pacific in 8 hours. Prior to this, if you were living, say, along the eastern coast of North America and you wanted to sail to the west coast, you would have to sail all the way down the east coast of North America, Central America, South America, most likely go through the Straits of Magellan, and then come up along the western coast and sail northward. It would take a long time. Now, in 8 hours, you can cut straight across Panama. So again, quicker travel led to greater profits for businessmen. It also gave easier control, which made it easier to move troops, give commands, and send supplies. We also see improvements in communications technology. In 1830, it took 2 years to get a letter from Great Britain to India and back. Technology helped solve this problem. By 1850, steam mail ships cut the time from 2 hours to 2 months. By 1870, the invention of the telegraph and the use of its electronic technology aid in improving communications. So now, you could send a telegram from India to England and then get a return or a reply in 4 hours. 2 hours there, 2 hours back. So think back on those time spans, those time frames. Initially, it takes years to send a message and get a message back, a reply. Think how much can change during that period of time. And even in 1850, when you've got steamships cutting that down to 2 months, that's still a long span of time. Now, the 4 hours with the telegraph in our day and age is a really long time. I mean, if you think about it, how many of you send a text to somebody and then if you don't have a reply within a minute, you're like, well, what the heck is wrong with them? But for the people living 100 plus years ago, this was just miraculous. So we see time being altered by technology.
So we have the question of how you would rule a far-flung empire when you're not in constant contact with that empire. Well, that was the problem up till the mid-1800s, the mid-19th century. It was one thing to conquer land, but then if you're not living there, if you're not ruling from there, you really don't know exactly what's going on at all times. But now, in the mid-19th century, these Europeans had the tools to do this, to stay in contact. They also had medicine. Europeans had found themselves vulnerable to new diseases in South America and Africa, diseases for which they had no immunity, things like malaria, and this prohibited Europeans from actually traveling into the interior of the continent. But now, new medications like quinine allowed Europeans to conquer diseases and kind of paved the way for more travel. Also, most of the countries lacked the heavy industrial technology necessary to make weapons. Things like the rapid fire rifle, the Maxim gun, which was a machine gun that could fire 11 bullets a second. You've also got more people knowing about and supporting overseas expansion than ever before. With expanded voting rights and literacy rights, the public was now really well informed, and a lot of citizens showed a lot of interest and pride in overseas expansion. So imperialists had an audience at home in an age when more people across the globe could read and march and vote. So this brings us to the scramble for Africa. So what was the scramble for Africa? Well, for a long time, Europeans had worked along the African coasts, buying slaves, gold, and so on. But they had never really penetrated deep into the continent. In fact, Africa was called the Dark Continent because so much of it was unknown. In 1807, Britain made the slave trade illegal. So from that point forward, you could own slaves, but not buy and sell. And what that meant was you're going to see a different type of people coming to Africa now. Instead of slave traders, now we start to see missionaries. So after 1807, we start to see missionaries coming and working at converting people. A military presence would come with them for protection. And they would send home wild tales of the riches of the interior of Africa. Things like diamonds and gold, which were just lying there waiting for people to pick them up, hidden away in darkest Africa. Well, these stories lured people to press forward. And at first, up until about 1870, they were individual efforts. And what I mean by that is individual, like, say, businessmen paying for an expedition to go and see what could be found. It's not the government. However, after 1870, state intervention increased, and once the governments become involved, this increased the potential for military conflict and military war. And there was the belief that countries needed to assert more direct political and military control over the territories they were claiming. It wasn't enough just to send teachers and missionaries. Those people got their foot in the door. But then it was up to the politicians and the soldiers. And in order to consolidate control, the home government sent out officers and government officials. Now, Britain was the largest proponent of free trade. It was looking for a market without competitors. It wanted to pull down all tariff barriers. Britain was the largest industrial nation on earth. It looked for new, unprotected markets where they could buy raw materials and sell goods. Other countries followed, like France and Germany. They followed Britain's lead, but they did not have the free trade government like England. They're looking for markets with no competition, and they thought Africa was a good place for this. And we also have countries like Germany and Italy, for example, who are looking for status. Because what better way to build up your country than to claim colonies and build an empire? Britain was perceived as the master of the oceans. France and Germany wanted more land, which would give them power and prestige. The flag of each country followed trade, but it also followed this hunger for prestige and status. And so the scramble for Africa refers to this period in the last part of the 19th century, where European countries basically came in and scrambled to claim colonies. And they gobbled up, in essence, most of the continent. And in this scramble for colonies in Africa, European imperialists or countries created boundaries. So they'd go in, they'd claim a territory, they would draw a boundary. This belongs to Britain, this belongs to France. And this gave them much more extensive power and control and influence. This annexation of Africa, this scramble for Africa, took place very fast. The key players were Germany, France, and Britain. And they recognized that if the scramble continued as quickly as it had been, there would be a military conflict. With this in mind, this idea of a military conflict, the Berlin Conference was held in 1884. It regulated the scramble and said that it was not enough to plant a flag. You must also occupy the land. So what that meant was it wasn't enough for a representative of, say, England to go into an area, claim that area for England, plant the flag, say, okay, this all belongs to England, and then move on. No, now they do that, but the land also becomes permanently occupied, usually by military forces. And this is what prompts the Fashoda incident in 1898. The Fashoda incident, also known as the Fashoda crisis, was the climactic event caused by years of territorial disputes in Africa between France and Britain. It was a matter of national honor, with imperialists on both sides figuring out if their dominance of the African continent was at stake. So what happened? Well, Britain occupied Egypt. France wanted an area known as the Sudan, which contained the headwaters of the Nile. Whoever controlled this area would control Egypt. Britain was looking to establish a continuous strip of territory from Cape Town in the south up to Cairo. France wanted to establish an overland route from the Red Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. So the French sent an army under General Marchand, and Britain sent theirs led by General Kitchener. Kitchener arrived first, with Marchand arriving about 2 months later. And they met at this place called Fashoda. And they're just there. These two armies are camped out, waiting. They're waiting for orders. And think about what happens when you're tense. You enter a tense situation anyway, and that tension just continues to rise, and you're on hold. You're waiting to be told what to do. The order's not forthcoming. You know the other guys over there on the other side, your stress and anxiety are going to increase. Well, that's what happens here. You've got these two armies waiting, each ready at a moment's notice to fight. And it added to the stress and tension and anxiety. It didn't help that back home in Europe, there was a war frenzy being cooked up by the press. And so you see this picture here where it says what they saw at home. This is an illustration that appeared in a newspaper over in Europe. And it looks like war, a war situation. Well, it was yellow journalism, this type of journalism that exaggerates events and ideas and situations, a type of journalism that twists facts. And that's what was happening back in Europe, this war frenzy that's being cooked up. Now, there was no war, but it did add to the tension. And finally, fearing war, the French government issued orders to Marchand, withdraw and back down. He did, and an armed clash was barely avoided. And here you see a political cartoon of the time showing the two generals waiting for orders. And the thing about the Fashoda incident is that in reality, nothing much happened here. But it's important because the Fashoda incident ushered in a new order of confrontational policy. It's kind of like that game Chicken. See who can outlast, who can last till the last minute. Challenge to see if the other side will back down. And if you think about it, that's a very dangerous way to do business. And it marks the beginning of an era in which friction between colonial powers becomes more and more common. At the end of the scramble for Africa, France was the winner, technically. In terms of area controlled, France won because they had the most. However, Britain controlled the wealthiest and most strategically important areas. Germany, Italy, other countries also ended up controlling area. This scramble for Africa took place very quickly. And, we talked at the beginning of the course about the initial exploration of Africa. It began in the 1500s, actually the 1400s by the Portuguese. Well, in 1800, only 4% of the African continent was in European hands. By 1900, 90% of Africa was in European hands. There were only two countries that were exceptions, and this is Ethiopia and Liberia, which was actually controlled by the United States. It was created as a haven for freed slaves. So during the scramble for Africa, or as a result of the scramble for Africa, the African continent came under European control. Now, you are reading Things Fall Apart, the story of a Nigerian tribe, the Igbo. And in this book, you see the impact of imperialism. You see the Europeans, in this case the British, come in and take over. They impose their government, their economy, their religion, and so forth. And you see the impact of that, the rippling impact on the people, on the Igbo. And you see by the end how this culture, which had survived quite well for many, many centuries, this culture can't stand up to the changes, and it ends up falling apart. And that's what's happening all over the African continent. And here you just see some scenes from Africa during this period of time. You see at the top a baptism with African natives who have been converted to Christianity, and then down at the bottom a Christian mission. Here you see a government official typing a letter to send home while he's watched with curiosity by the natives, or the native children. Here you see the various uniforms worn by British troops. And this was an actual postcard from the 1800s. They had different uniforms according to the regiment they were in, where they came from, and where they were stationed. And they were stationed all over the globe. And you have many European countries participating in this, including smaller countries like Belgium. The Belgians actually controlled a large territory. Their colony was the Congo, the Belgian Congo. And here's one of my personal favorites. Here we see missionaries, a reverend and his wife, in the Belgian Congo having tea, bringing a little bit of home with them. So what about Asia? Well, in Asia, the European powers, for the most part, worked with the existing hierarchy. And this also began in the 15 and 1600s. Before the 1800s, or the mid-1800s, European government involvement was limited, with most of the involvement being private joint stock trading companies, companies like the East India Company. After mid-century, though, the government takes a more active role, and this goes along with what we just talked about. Well, India becomes one of the prizes of the British Empire. In 1849, the British government officially exerted control over India. In 1877, India became an official part of the British Empire. Queen Victoria was declared the Empress of India, and India was referred to as a jewel in her crown. So why India? What is so important about this area? India was a huge cotton producing region. This was really important to Great Britain because at this time Britain is one of the leading textile manufacturers in the world, cotton textiles. So they needed a steady source of cotton. Now they're getting a steady source of cotton from the American South. But if you think about it, what happens in the 1860s? The Civil War. And when the war first broke out, the South wasn't worried because the American Southerners believed that the British would just continue buying their cotton. That would help them finance the war. Great idea. What's the problem with it? Well, the problem is that it rests on the assumption that the British will work with the South. The British didn't want to get involved in the war, so they don't buy cotton from the South. And they realize, okay, well, we really don't need those Southerners' cotton because we can get it from India. And this is when India becomes doubly important for the Americans, or for the British, I mean. So, huge cotton producing region. There's something else. The British bought a lot of tea from China. Tea is the most popular beverage. But they were very upset because the Chinese wouldn't buy anything from them until they discovered opium. And the British discovered that there was a huge market for opium in China. And so India becomes really important to the British. They need it for the cotton. They need it for the opium. Then we have China. The British are very interested in China. As I said a moment ago, they buy a lot of tea from China. It's Britain's most popular beverage. But they couldn't find anything the Chinese wanted from them until they hit on opium. And so they start selling all this opium to the Chinese, and it becomes a huge source of income for the British. Now, the Chinese resented this. They didn't want all this opium brought into their country. There would be these opium dens, which would be like gentlemen's clubs almost, where you could go and you could just get high basically and spend the weekend or however long in a hallucinogenic haze. And the Chinese did not like opium. They didn't want it brought in to their country because of the negative impact it had on their people. It leads to the Opium Wars. The Chinese government had told the British to stop selling the opium, and the British refused. In fact, the British government stepped in to defend the British merchants and said basically, hey, they have the right to free trade. You cannot stop them. And so in result, we have the Opium Wars, where we actually have battle, where the British Army is sent in to defend the British businessmen involved in the selling of opium. And it was a bloody series of battles. In the end, the Chinese lost. They did not have the technology they needed to stand up to the British. And what we see is that between 1842 and 1895, there were a series of wars pitting China against the European powers. It starts with the loss in the Opium Wars. And in fact, as a result of China losing the Opium Wars, we see the British taking control of important ports and territories in China. And then, like I said, between 1842 and 1895, there's another series of wars pitting the two sides against each other, and in every case, China lost. It was not as technologically advanced. By 1895, all Chinese ports were in European hands. And so more and more, the Chinese people come to really resent the Europeans. And the European powers come in and carve China up into different areas of control. All of this leads to another rebellion. And this is the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. This was a popular rebellion. Popular meaning it's the people rising up. It's not necessarily the government or the army. It's called the Boxer Rebellion because it was started by boxers, these men who belonged to a society known as the Society of Harmonious Fists. And so they started this rebellion, and everyone just starts jumping on the bandwagon, and they were fighting against European influence. And it was a bloody series of wars. There were cities where you would have the Europeans living in a certain sector, and you'd have just massacres. A lot of people massacred. Sadly for the Chinese, in the end, they lose. And here you see foreign troops, the British and soldiers from other European countries who had been sent to fight. You see these troops in the Forbidden City. And this Forbidden City was like the inner courts or courtyard of the palace, and all the governmental complex. And this was an area where only the emperor was supposed to go. Other people, common people, did not have access to this. And yet here you have all of these foreign powers in this area. So it was kind of like a slap in the face to the Chinese. It was, a way of just not respecting their customs at all, because this was considered to be a very sacred place. And here you see some of the prisoners taken during the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion and the violence associated with it, as long as the other revolts throughout the century, lead to something known as the open door policy. This was a policy that was put forth by the United States Secretary of State, John Hay. And basically it made China a doormat. It said the door was open to all European powers. The purpose was to try to ensure American interest in China. It said that trade should be open to everybody, and that the great powers should respect the territorial integrity of China. So basically, as I said, the open door policy made China a doormat. They had no say. You've got the European powers and the Americans carving the country up for themselves. And in the top left, you see a political cartoon of the time showing some of the monarchs of Europe at the time. You see Queen Victoria there on the bottom left, the Kaiser, the King of Germany, next to her, Tsar Nicholas of Russia, and the Japanese emperor, and then another ruler. And this signifies all these rulers, these European countries, literally carving the country up for themselves, while the Chinese have no say in the matter whatsoever. So here you see the colonial takeover in Southeast Asia, and you can see by this map, as it says, or as I said, by the early 20th century, virtually the entire region of Southeast Asia was under Western control. So much like Africa, you've got the Europeans coming in and just exerting their influence, their power, and their control over these countries, which are now no longer independent. And here you see an image from the French Empire. And just as a little aside, a lot of what happens in the 1800s and early 1900s in these European colonies in various places in the world are going to impact what happens later. For example, Vietnam was a French colony, and the French efforts to pull out in the 1950s leave a power vacuum, which leads to various peoples coming in and fighting for control, which leads ultimately to the Vietnam War. So let's look again at some of the motives for imperialism. We have economic aims. These are probably the most obvious, that tie to the Industrial Revolution. Countries want to make a profit. Colonies provided outlets for surplus money. Colonies provided new markets for industrial goods and sources for raw materials. Colonies also provided outlets for immigration in countries that were overpopulated. A British man named J.A. Hobson wrote a book in 1902. It was called Imperialism, and in it he outlined the economic reasons for imperialism. So he outlines all of them. But then he concludes that the economic results were not matching the economic expectations. So, these countries thought that they get all this business and all these raw materials from these countries, just wasn't working out that way. While some raw materials were exploited and exported, things like coffee, diamonds, and gold, they just didn't stand out. They weren't enough to justify imperialism. And in reality, colonies really offered very few markets. The bulk of trade remained between Western states. Most Western investment capital went into other ventures in Western Europe. So the colonies did not absorb excess goods or capital. And in fact, most colonies over time become economic liabilities. If you think about it, the government has to send a lot of people out. They have to send everyone out: telegraph officers, the military, medical personnel, and on and on. That costs a lot of money. And even though a lot of companies and firms might have profited, that did not mean that their country as a whole did. So those are actually two of the motivations. Then we have God and civilization, religion. The desire to spread the word of God and civilization. The problem was, as many pointed out, that it was white man's civilization. Missionaries, educators, humanitarians, they all spoke of spreading enlightened values, and in some cases this was accomplished. Slavery and the slave trade were abolished in the British Empire. In India, irrigation and other modernizing technology was introduced. Schools, hospitals, and so on were established. The imperialists ended centuries of tribal warfare. So those are good things. But the flip side is that civilizing the natives, as the Europeans used to say, often meant not just schools and hospitals, but imposing Western control and power, and imposing the West's self-image of cultural superiority. Basically, these Westerners coming in and saying, like you see in Things Fall Apart, well, this is the way we do things, because this is the best way, because you people obviously don't know what you're doing, so let us show you. Rudyard Kipling was a British writer who lived in India for a long time. And you might have heard of him. He wrote several books, including The Jungle Book, which you might be familiar with. But he also, in 1899, wrote a poem called White Man's Burden. And in this, he talked about the mission to enlighten Africans and Asians. He said it was the white man's, quote, moral, religious, and humanitarian obligation to enlighten and upgrade the lesser breeds. So think about what he's saying there. He is referring to these people they're colonizing as being less than the Europeans, and saying that, well, because they're less than us, it's really up to us, our moral obligation, to help them. And every country had its own version of the white man's burden. The natives everywhere bore the brunt, enduring economic exploitation, environmental ruin, social discrimination, and the collapse of their traditional societies. So here you see a political cartoon from the time, actually from an American paper, showing this idea of the white man's burden. And you see a soldier carrying a native who doesn't even look human up the hill. So it's up to the superior white man to uplift and help the natives, is basically what this is saying. Another motivation for the new imperialism was social Darwinism. And this, if you recall, was the misapplication of Darwin's idea, that idea of survival of the fittest applied to cultures, societies, and people. And this idea is basically saying that human communities were locked in a battle, and only the strongest would deserve to survive. Well, this is an idea that Europeans and Americans used to promote expansion and imperialism over others. Social Darwinists argued that this was progress. This was how society moved forward. Well, it's very dangerous thinking if that progress depends on the elimination of entire groups of people, entire tribes. And here you see another political cartoon of the time showing this idea of social Darwinism. You see Uncle Sam representing America. You see Britain uplifting the, quote, inferior in their minds people and lifting them up towards civilization. Another motivation was nationalism and state power. This was an outgrowth of aggressive nationalism. Colonies symbolized prestige, power, and stature. The Italian and German governments saw overseas expansion as necessary to their inclusion in politics on the continent. Because if you think about it, they're brand new countries. They need to find a way to build up their power and status. Weltpolitik was Kaiser Wilhelm II's program of expansion. He was the German king. And he realized that if Germany, a brand new country, wanted to be included in European politics, it was going to have to get involved. And so Weltpolitik was his program, where he said, quote, a newly unified Germany should pursue power and prestige through colonies. Because basically, national pride argued that you didn't get left behind. Yet another motivation were the national or security interests of a particular country. For example, Great Britain ruled India, but their rule of India expanded their security into other areas. They became interested in surrounding areas, those areas around India, in order to protect their crown jewel and provide more cushion and support. For example, British control of the Suez Canal in the 1880s and 1890s extended British security interests all the way to the Red Sea. They basically wanted to provide a buffer zone for the area they actually considered the most important. It was also common for governments to launch overseas drives for colonies for domestic reasons, to gain national support at home. For example, if a country was defeated militarily, it could soothe its bruised ego by expanding abroad. It was a way to rally national support. Imperialism had global consequences. Europeans claimed and conquered large empires in Africa and Asia. They disrupted traditional political units, such as tribes and small kingdoms. Often they united rival people under a single government, imposing stability and order where local conflicts had raged for centuries. By the early 1900s, though, resistance to imperialism was taking a new course. In Africa and Asia, Western educated elites were organizing nationalist movements to end colonial rule. At the same time, the competition for empire was fueling tensions among Western powers. In 1914 and again in 1939, imperialist ambitions would contribute to the outbreak of two shattering world wars.